The courtroom fell into a stunned, suffocating silence as 18-year-old Dylan Reeves threw his head back and laughed, a sound so inappropriate and chilling that it seemed to violate the very sanctity of the judicial chamber. His eyes, cold and gleaming with malicious amusement, swept across the gallery until they found their target, the Thornton family, seated in the front row, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged them decades in mere months. Dylan's laughter was not nervous or involuntary, not the product of shock or psychological breakdown. It was deliberate, calculated, a weapon wielded with precision to inflict maximum pain on people who had already suffered the unthinkable loss of their daughter. He leaned back in his chair at the defense table, arms crossed over his chest, and met the horrified stares with a smirk that communicated a single, devastating message. He did not care. He had never cared, and he believed with absolute certainty that nothing they could do would touch him. But Dylan Reeves had made a catastrophic miscalculation, one born of arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of the man presiding over his trial. Judge William Hartwell was a 30-year veteran of the bench, a jurist whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for those who showed contempt for the dignity of his courtroom and the suffering of victims. Dylan had mistaken the judge's measured temperament for weakness, his adherence to procedure for indecisiveness, and his patience for tolerance. He was about to learn, in the most definitive way possible, that there are limits to judicial restraint, and that when those limits are crossed, the full weight of the law descends like a hammer forged from righteous fury and unwavering principle.
He seemed to believe that he could outsmart everyone in the courtroom, that his intelligence made him superior to the judge, the prosecutors, and the jury members who would decide his fate. It was this arrogance, this fundamental inability to grasp the gravity of his situation that would prove to be his undoing. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in late January, with snow falling gently outside the courthouse windows, creating a peaceful scene that stood in stark contrast to the grim proceedings about to unfold. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with overflow crowds watching on video monitors in an adjacent room. Security was heightened, with additional bailiffs stationed throughout the courthouse, a response to the high-profile nature of the case and the strong emotions it had generated. The jury selection process had taken 3 days, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for bias, preconceived notions, and the ability to render a fair verdict based solely on the evidence. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 60s, representing a cross-section of the Millbrook community. They took their seats in the jury box with solemn expressions, aware of the weight of responsibility that rested on their shoulders. Judge Hartwell entered the courtroom, and all present rose in respect for the court. He took his seat at the bench, his presence commanding without being domineering, and addressed the jury with preliminary instructions about their duties and responsibilities. He explained that they were to base their verdict solely on the evidence presented, that they were to presume the defendant innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that they were to set aside any sympathy or prejudice in reaching their decision. His voice was measured and clear, each word carefully chosen, establishing from the outset the seriousness and dignity of the proceedings. The opening statements began with Thomas Barrett approaching the lectern. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a bearing that communicated both authority and compassion. He did not begin with legal arguments or procedural explanations, but with a story, the story of Amanda Thornton, a 15-year-old girl whose life had been filled with promise and potential. He described her love of debate, her volunteer work at the animal shelter, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. He painted a vivid picture of a real person, a daughter, a friend, a young woman whose future had been violently stolen. Barrett then transitioned to the events of September 23rd, describing Amanda's walk home, the predator who had been watching and waiting, and the horrific violence that had ended her life. His delivery was controlled but passionate, his voice never rising to theatrics but carrying an undercurrent of righteous anger at the senselessness of the crime. He outlined the evidence the jury would see: the DNA match, the fibers, the student ID card found in Dylan's car, the surveillance footage, and the physical evidence that created an unbreakable chain of proof. The evidence in this case, Barrett said, making eye contact with each juror, will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Dylan Reeves stalked Amanda Thornton, abducted her, strangled her, and disposed of her body like she was trash. The evidence will show you a cold, calculating killer who showed no mercy to his victim and has shown no remorse since. And when you have seen all the evidence, you will have no choice but to find him guilty of first-degree murder. He returned to his seat as the courtroom remained in heavy silence, his opening statement having set the stage for the prosecution's case with devastating effectiveness. Margaret Chen rose for the defense's opening statement, her task made infinitely more difficult by the strength of the prosecution's case and her client's behavior. She acknowledged the tragedy of Amanda's death, expressing genuine sympathy for the Thornton family, but she urged the jury to remember that their role was not to render judgment based on emotion, but on the law and the evidence. She argued that while the prosecution would present physical evidence placing Dylan in contact with Amanda, they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had intended to kill her, that what might have begun as an ill-conceived attempt to talk to her had spiraled out of control, resulting in a tragic accident rather than premeditated murder. It was a weak argument, and Chen knew it, but it was the only angle available to her given the evidence. She promised the jury that they would hear about Dylan's difficult childhood, his struggles with mental health, and the factors that had shaped his behavior. She asked them to keep an open mind, to listen carefully to all the evidence, and to remember that the burden of proof rested entirely on the prosecution. It was a competent opening statement, delivered with professional skill, but it lacked the emotional power of Barrett's presentation, and more importantly, it was being undermined in real time by the defendant himself. Throughout both opening statements, Dylan's behavior was a masterclass in self-destruction. He slouched in his chair, his posture communicating boredom and disdain. When Barrett described Amanda's injuries, Dylan was observed rolling his eyes, a gesture seen by several jurors who exchanged shocked glances. When his own attorney spoke of his difficult childhood, Dylan shook his head in dismissal, as if he rejected the narrative of victimhood she was attempting to construct on his behalf. He fidgeted constantly, examining his fingernails, adjusting his tie, and at one point appearing to stifle a yawn during the prosecutor's most emotionally charged passage about Amanda's final moments. Several juror members were visibly disturbed by his demeanor, their expressions shifting from neutral attention to unexplainable disapproval. Margaret Chen noticed her client's behavior and placed a hand on his arm, whispering to him what was presumably a warning, but Dylan shrugged off her touch and continued his display of casual contempt. The evidentiary phase of the trial unfolded over the next 2 weeks, with the prosecution presenting a case that was as comprehensive as it was damning. The first witnesses were the responding officers who had searched for Amanda, their testimony establishing the timeline and the community's response to her disappearance. Then came the sanitation worker who had discovered her body, a man named Robert Mills, whose voice cracked with emotion as he described finding Amanda in the dumpster, the image clearly still haunting him months later. The medical examiner, Dr. Raymond Foster, provided clinical testimony about the cause and manner of death, describing the ligature marks on Amanda's neck, the defensive wounds on her arms and legs, and the evidence of a prolonged struggle. He explained that strangulation death was neither quick nor painful, that Amanda would have been conscious and aware during the attack, fighting desperately for air as her windpipe was compressed. The testimony was graphic and difficult, causing Patricia Thornton to sob quietly in the gallery while her husband held her, his own face a mask of barely controlled anguish. Throughout Dr. Foster's testimony, Dillon maintained his posture of indifference, occasionally glancing at the photographs of Amanda's injuries displayed on the courtroom monitors with what appeared to be curiosity rather than horror or remorse. His detachment was so complete, so utterly alien to normal human response, that several jurors were observed studying him with expressions of confused revulsion, trying to reconcile his youthful appearance with the complete absence of conscience his behavior suggested. The prosecution's case concluded with victim impact testimony, though Judge Hartwell ruled that such testimony would be limited at this stage of the trial, with more extensive statements reserved for sentencing if a guilty verdict was returned. Nevertheless, Barrett was permitted to call Patricia Thornton to the stand, not to testify about the facts of the case, but to speak briefly about who Amanda had been as a person. Patricia approached the witness stand with slow, painful steps, as if the weight of her grief made movement difficult. She had aged visibly in the months since her daughter's death, her face lined with sorrow, her eyes holding an emptiness that spoke of a loss so profound that it had fundamentally altered her existence. She spoke in a quiet, trembling voice about Amanda's kindness, her dreams, her love of animals, and the light that she had brought to their family. She described the last conversation she had with her daughter, a mundane exchange about Amanda's school project, words that had seemed insignificant at the time, but had become precious beyond measure. "I never got to say goodbye," she said, her voice breaking. "I never got to tell her one more time how much I loved her, how proud I was of her, how much she meant to us. He took that from me. He took everything from me." She turned to look directly at Dillon, her eyes searching his face for any sign of humanity, any flicker of remorse or understanding. "Do you even care?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Do you have any idea what you've done? She was 15 years old. She was just a child. She had her whole life ahead of her." Dillon met her gaze with an expression of such cold indifference that it sent a visible shock through the courtroom. He did not look away, did not show discomfort or shame, simply stared back at her with empty eyes. And then, in a moment that would define the entire trial, in an action so incomprehensible and monstrous that it seemed to freeze time itself, Dillon smiled.
During the recess, Margaret Chen had what could only be described as a crisis meeting with her client in the holding cell adjacent to the courtroom. Her voice, normally measured and professional, was sharp with urgency and barely suppressed rage. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You smiled at that woman. You smiled at a mother grieving her murdered daughter. The jury saw you. The judge saw you. You just destroyed any chance you had at anything less than a life sentence." Dillon leaned back against the wall of the cell, his arms crossed, his expression one of bored annoyance. "She was being dramatic," he said dismissively. "All that crying and carrying on. It was pathetic." Margaret stared at him, her professional detachment crumbling in the face of such profound sociopathy. "That woman's daughter is dead because of you," she said, her voice trembling. "She has every right to her grief. And you need to understand that if you show any more disrespect, any more of this callous behavior, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. Do you understand me? The rest of your life." Dillon shrugged. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just smiled. People are being too sensitive." The public defender realized in that moment that she was not dealing with someone who could be reasoned with, who could be coached or controlled. She was defending a person who lacked the fundamental psychological equipment necessary to understand why his behavior was problematic. She returned to the courtroom with the knowledge that her client was determined to engineer his own destruction, and that her role had become less about mounting a defense than about documenting his incompetence for potential appellate review. When the trial resumed, Judge Hartwell addressed Dillon directly,
his voice cold and controlled. "Mr. Reeves, I want to make something absolutely clear to you. This courtroom is a place where serious matters are decided, where justice is sought, and where respect for the process and for all participants is not optional, but mandatory. Your behavior during Mrs. Thornton's testimony was inappropriate, disrespectful, and deeply disturbing. If you display such behavior again, I will have you removed from this courtroom, and the trial will proceed in your absence. Do you understand me?" Dillon met the judge's gaze with an expression that was carefully neutral but carried an undercurrent of defiance. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, the words correct but the tone somehow mocking. Judge Hartwell studied him for a long moment, his experienced eyes seeing something in the young man that confirmed his worst assessments. "See that you do," he said finally. "The prosecution may continue." With the prosecution having rested its case, the burden shifted to the defense to present evidence that might create reasonable doubt, or at least mitigate the severity of Dillon's culpability. Margaret Chen's strategy was limited by the overwhelming strength of the prosecution's case and by her client's behavior. She could not argue innocence, so she focused on attempting to prove that the killing had been unpremeditated, that it had resulted from an impulsive decision rather than a calculated plan, which would reduce the charge from first-degree murder to something lesser. Her first witness was a forensic psychologist, Dr. Nathan Pierce, who had evaluated Dillon and would testify about his mental state and psychological functioning. Dr. Pierce was a respected expert who had testified in numerous criminal trials, and his credentials were impeccable. Under direct examination, he explained that he had spent 6 hours interviewing Dillon and had administered a battery of psychological tests designed to assess personality structure, cognitive functioning, and potential mental illness. His diagnosis was carefully worded. Dillon showed indicators of narcissistic personality traits, difficulties with empathy and emotional regulation, and what the doctor termed significant deficits in moral reasoning. Dr. Pierce explained that individuals with such personality structures often acted impulsively, driven by immediate gratification without adequate consideration of consequences. He testified that while Dillon understood the difference between right and wrong on an intellectual level, his ability to emotionally process the impact of his actions on others was severely impaired. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Pierce concluded, "Dillon Reeves has significant psychological deficits that affect his judgment and impulse control. While he is legally sane and understood the nature of his actions, his capacity to premeditate and plan is questionable given his psychological profile." It was testimony designed to support a reduction of charges, to suggest that Dillon's crime had been impulsive rather than calculated. However, Thomas Barrett's cross-examination systematically demolished this narrative. Barrett began by establishing that Dillon had no history of diagnosed mental illness, that he had never been hospitalized psychiatrically, and that he had functioned adequately in school and social settings. He then walked Dr. Pierce through the evidence of premeditation, the surveillance footage showing Dillon following Amanda's route, the fact that he had been observed in the neighborhood hours before the attack, the cigarette he had smoked after disposing of her body. "Dr. Pierce," Barrett said, his voice sharp and precise, "you testified that Dillon has difficulty with impulse control and premeditation. But doesn't the evidence show someone who planned his actions, someone who stalked his victim, waited for the right moment, and then took steps to conceal the crime?" Dr. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "The behaviors you describe could be consistent with someone who is acting on impulse but taking opportunistic steps." "Opportunistic steps?" Barrett interrupted. "Doctor, he followed her for blocks. He grabbed her when no one was watching. He strangled her, put her body in his trunk, drove to a remote location, and disposed of her in a dumpster. Then he smoked a cigarette. Does that sound like someone in the grip of an uncontrollable impulse? Or does that sound like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and took steps to avoid detection?" The psychologist conceded that the behaviors could be interpreted as showing premeditation, that individuals with personality traits were capable of planning and executing complex actions. Barrett pressed further, forcing Dr. Pierce to admit that most people with personality disorders never commit violent crimes, that such traits were not a legal defense, and that Dylan had made choices at every step of the process, choices to follow Amanda, to attack her, to kill her, and to hide the evidence. By the end of the cross-examination, Dr. Pierce's testimony had been effectively neutralized, transformed from a potential mitigating factor into simply another confirmation of Dylan's dangerousness. Throughout Dr. Pierce's testimony, Dylan had maintained his pattern of inappropriate behavior, shaking his head in disagreement with aspects of the psychological assessment, smirking when Dr. Pierce described his narcissistic traits as if they were compliments rather than pathological indicators. The defense's remaining witnesses were character witnesses, individuals who had known Dylan at various stages of his life and were prepared to testify that he had shown positive qualities, that he had been capable of kindness or achievement. Margaret Chen called Dylan's former high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, who testified that Dylan had been academically capable but socially isolated, that he had struggled to form meaningful peer relationships. Under cross-examination, Barrett elicited the information that Dylan had been referred to Mrs. Rodriguez multiple times for incidents involving intimidation of other students, that teachers had expressed concerns about his lack of empathy, and that he had been suspended once for a physical altercation with another student. Each witness intended to humanize Dylan instead provided additional evidence of warning signs that had been ignored, of a trajectory toward violence that had been visible to those willing to see it. The defense's final witness was Dylan's mother, Janet Reeves, and her testimony was perhaps the most poignant and tragic of the entire trial. Janet was a woman who had worked tirelessly to provide for her son after her father had abandoned them when Dylan was 5. She had sacrificed her own needs, worked double shifts, done everything she could to give him opportunities. She took the stand with visible reluctance, her love for her son warring with her growing recognition of what he had become. Under direct examination by Margaret Chen, Janet spoke about Dylan's childhood, describing him as a bright but difficult child who had struggled with anger and had shown concerning behaviors from an early age. She admitted, with obvious pain, that she had perhaps been too lenient, too willing to excuse his behavior because she felt guilty about his father's absence, about the time she had to spend working rather than parenting. "I wanted to believe he was just going through a phase," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to believe that if I just loved him enough, if I just gave him enough support, he would grow out of it. But he didn't. He got worse. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to reach him." Margaret Chen asked him about Dylan's relationship with Amanda Thornton, and Janet testified that she had no knowledge of any prior contact between them, that Dylan had never mentioned Amanda, and that she had been shocked and horrified when she learned of his arrest. "I don't understand how this happened," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand how my son could do something like this. I raised him to respect others, to value life. I don't know what went wrong."